Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about the subject of anime games and whether or not they're mainstream. In fact, we don't really need to restrict ourselves to just games, we can look at anime as a whole, which is actually a pretty broad subject. To those people wanting a broad answer, I will give a broad yes. Finding someone into anime games or anime in general is pretty easy. Additionally, you see anime references and memes basically everywhere on the internet. And if you walk into an EB Games and presumably GameStop in the States as well, there'll be trailers for anime games running on the screens all day. But as usual, things are always more complex than they first appear. In fact, I'd argue that the answer is both yes and no, leaning towards mostly yes. Though I'm also going to mention some points as to why some people might not consider anime to be mainstream. It really depends on how you look at the subject. To me, it's similar to superheroes and science fiction here in the West. Both are mainstream genres, yet many people still consider them as terribly geeky topics as well. When it comes to mainstream success, there's no denying that there's numerous examples of popular anime and anime games. The best example for both anime and anime games I can think of is Pokemon, of course. It's literally part of pop culture for, I'll venture and say, 2.5 generations. So like late Gen Xers to Millennials and now Generation Z. In other words, according to my analytics, almost everyone watching this channel will have some sort of knowledge about Pokemon, even if they haven't seen the show or played the games. It's a bit like being able to spot Star Wars references without ever having watched Star Wars. And then there's all those other numerous 90s and 2000s shows that I probably don't need to mention. I think anime's increase in popularity can be observed a number of different ways. The late 2000s and early 2010s saw some pretty decent growth. For example, for games, notice all the franchises that emerged on the PS3, Vita, and later in the mid-2010s, the PS4 and also on Steam. Now, something like Neptunia, for example, while being pretty popular for being a niche game, isn't what I'd call mainstream. But it and other niche franchises wouldn't have been so consistently localized and ported to the PC if the audience for them didn't exist. In other words, the amount of people interested in anime games became larger, which in turn resulted in the exportation of more fringe titles. Now let's take a look at manga. This is my local Chapters. In case you're not from Canada, Chapters along with Indigo and Kohl's is our biggest bookstore. All three belong together. Here's where the manga section was for basically a decade. This is where it was moved to about 5 years ago. Look at how much bigger it is. It's basically at least double the size. It's the same size as the graphic novel section. I remember when manga could only be found in the teen or kids sections of bookstores, but now it's got its own dedicated space. That being said, my library, while being pretty awesome with video games, still isn't categorizing manga correctly, so I'm sure that's still a thing at many other stores around the world. Also, shout out to light novels becoming more and more popular too. I pray that one day the Strike Witches light novels will get translated. Different countries have different things that are mainstream, of course. For example, I know that France was way ahead of most Western countries in terms of anime and manga adoption. France has a pretty rich history when it comes to animation and comics themselves, and I remember seeing a number of them as a kid in Germany. Also, there's that Daft Punk music video that I'm pretty sure everybody's seen before. Speaking of Germany, kann jemand vielleicht einen Kommentar schreiben, ob Anime in Deutschland eigentlich beliebt ist? I haven't been there for a very long time, but in the 90s I had the impression that there was a decent amount of anime on TV. I remember watching Cat's Eye, Kickers, and Mila Superstar years before Pokemon existed, and I don't think those are particularly famous in North America. Actually, now as I'm typing this script, I'm reminded of something from elementary school. There's an anime from the 70s called Heidi, which must have been decently popular in Germany in the 90s. We would sing a version of the opening song, but with the lyrics changed, as if Heidi was living in the sewers, not the mountains. And whenever we had a field trip, we'd replace Heidi with School Bus, because, well, they usually weren't the cleanest buses ever. The bus drivers must have hated us, especially when we got to the yodeling part. I googled the lyrics and apparently it really was a thing. I really hope a German who's watching knows what I'm talking about here. Anyway, like my Jetta that needs an alignment, we're starting to veer off into the ditch, so let's get back on track. We could go on and on about other stuff, like the fact that Crunchyroll exists, and that anime is being used as a basis for various movies, but I think you get the idea. Overall, I think anime and anime games are for the most part mainstream, even if most of them aren't mainstream. I mean, it's not like every Western game is mainstream either, or else there wouldn't be all these obscure indie games. That being said, I feel there are still a lot of people who don't think anime is something that can be considered mainstream yet. I think one of the biggest reasons for that is how anime is defined. Like, what is it even? The word anime these days is something that can mean multiple things. While in Japan, anime usually refers to animated works, the West uses the term anime to refer to Japanese cartoons, but at the same time, it's also a term that can be used to refer to the visual style of other mediums that aren't animation, like games, of course. So anime isn't a medium, but more like a genre, which isn't correct either because there are genres of anime, of course, just like with anything else. But then calling anime a visual style isn't quite right because there are a lot of styles within anime, which makes anime more like an art movement, but I would hesitate to call it something like that. Art movements are usually more focused, even if they span multiple mediums. And you can spot references to art movements in certain animes, like if you look at Madoka Magica and also some of the crazier parts of Setsubo Sensei, like there's all these Dada elements thrown in. The problem is that the word anime is like a label of sorts, and labels lead to generalizations. And that's a bit of a problem because the term anime encompasses so many things. I did mention I watched anime in the 90s as a kid, but I didn't know they were Japanese, though I vaguely was aware that there was this art style across multiple shows. Mainly they were just cartoons to me at the time. It was only because of Pokemon that I started becoming aware that anime was actually a thing. I had no particular interest in anime at the time. A friend in high school showed me all the usual late 90s and mid 2000s shows like Bleach, Naruto, One Piece, Full Metal Alchemist, and probably one or two more, but I couldn't get into them at all. In fact, I really disliked what I was shown, and at the time I wrote off anime as something I just couldn't understand and get into. When I was around 20 years old, I decided to give it another go, because the whole situation with anime was similar to my initial impression of metal music. I really didn't like it, and in fact, I cringed whenever something like Metallica or God forbid a guitar solo would make its way into my earhole. These days, I still don't really like Metallica, but I love metal and all of its strange little branches of subgenres. Also, I've been playing guitar for 11 years now. Turns out that anime was kind of similar in that regards for me. I still can't stand watching the shows that were initially recommended to me, or most shonen action stuff for that matter. Not that there's anything wrong with liking that or whatever you're into. Metal is something I ended up actually getting really passionate about once I found something that grabbed my attention positively, so I decided to dive into anime as well, which of course also meant that I found anime games I enjoyed too. Strangely enough, the reason this channel got started is because I combined my interest of metal and guitar playing and video games and anime. I combined the recording equipment with video games and Japanese niche games, and there you go. So basically what I'm saying is that the term anime can not only be used as a term to describe a broad similarity of works across multiple mediums, but at times it can also be a barrier of entry because of generalization. And there's also this thing called cultural difference. I really wanted to avoid using this term since it just gets thrown around to a point where it's used as a buzzword in place of a proper explanation, but the cultural differences between Japan and the West is real. Anime in general is often criticized for its sexual humor and fan service, though I honestly think this is mostly something that's unique to the US, though Germany and Australia have their moments too. I think Canada is a bit more relaxed about this sort of thing, considering how close we are to the States. Well, I mean, we're on top of the US. Look at this Blu-ray of Brave Witches. It's rated TVMA in the US, but it's rated 14A in Canada. If you look it up in the OFA database, you can even see that they obviously saw the fan service antics for themselves. but still went, yep, teenagers can watch this, no problem. Only younger than 14-year-olds need parental supervision. In turn, the Western world usually is okay with violence, while Japan doesn't really, while Japan often has issues with it. There's obviously exceptions, like, in Europe with censoring blood, and, probably Australia has beef with violence as well because they're Australia. But there's also instances where things from Japan are just seen as strange and weird. And often certain shows and games can't be translated or localized easily because things referencing something many Japanese people would know are often lost in translation. Wow, lost in translation. If we had a cliché counter, that would have gone off. Usually the thought of Western releases isn't even considered during the creation of a show or game. So when, say, a particularly unusual game does come out, here all the gaming sites go LOL anime and so on. But anyway, in the end, whether something is considered mainstream to someone doesn't change what I like or enjoy. But the continuous worldwide growth in popularity is certainly something that I've welcomed. I was constantly wondering whether a show, manga, or game I was interested in was going to be released here. And while that's still a pretty common worry, it was much worse even just 10 years ago. I can imagine things getting even better in the next 10 years. When I was in school, high school specifically, let's say, in the 2000s, anime was seen as a pretty nerdy thing. Or geeky, whatever, I don't care what kind of word you want to use for it. But as I got older and, in various workplaces, I just noticed that a lot of people would just openly talk about anime and everybody was cool with it. So I think it's well on its way to becoming, in quotes, normal. Let me know what you think of the subject. Obviously, this is a topic that can be discussed for ages, and I'd like to see what your angle on the subject is. I think there's a possibility of some interesting responses. If you liked the video, consider liking the video. Wow, that's a stupid sentence. What the hell was I thinking when I was writing that? But yeah, you can also subscribe if you want. If you want to support the channel, go to patreon.com/YSN and check out the various reward tiers or hit the join button to become a channel member. Remember, there's also a second channel you can subscribe to as well. You'll find anime niche game news there, as well as the occasional gameplay video. I haven't posted anything in the last week there, but things will pick up again, don't worry. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.